https://youtube.com/watch hỏi.v bằng CIVEBSR89AI. Sau khi con trai tôi qua đời, tôi đã giấu $200 triệu của nó khỏi con dâu, cho đến khi có kết quả xét nghiệm ADN. After my son died, I hid his $200 million from my daughter-in-law until DNA results came out. When her son died, people thought Margaret Cole would break down, but she didn't cry in front of anyone. She sat down and began to observe. The woman claiming to be her son's wife, pregnant, tears streaming down the television screen. Something was wrong with her. A story that's too perfect is often a fabricated one. And when the truth came out, it didn't just destroy a marriage, it destroyed everything she thought she knew about her family. Watch to the end. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching, so I know how far my story has come. A quiet woman, a dying wish, and a secret that would change everything. I want to be honest with you about something before I start. I am not a dramatic woman. I have never been the kind of person who raises her voice, who slams doors, or who makes scenes at family dinners. For 53 years, I lived quietly. I raised my boys, kept my house, made my casseroles, and smiled at the right moments. My neighbors would describe me as pleasant. My church ladies would say I was steady. My sons used to tease me about how I could sit through anything without flinching. I thought that was a virtue. I didn't know it was also a trap, because when the worst thing that can happen to a mother finally happened to me, when I lost Ethan, I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I sat in a hospital chair with my hands folded in my lap, and I nodded when the doctor spoke, and I said, "Thank you for everything you did," and I meant it. And then I went home, and I sat in my kitchen, and I made a cup of tea I didn't drink, and I stared at the wall for 4 hours. That is the kind of woman I am. But I'm also the kind of woman who keeps her promises. And it is that, only that, which explains everything that came after. Ethan Cole was 38 years old when he died. He was brilliant in the way that some people are brilliant. Not loudly, not in the way that fills a room and demands attention, but quietly, steadily, like a current running beneath everything. He had built his company, NeuroBridge, from a rented apartment in Austin with 2 used monitors and a whiteboard he'd found at a garage sale. By the time he died, NeuroBridge was valued at over $1 billion, and his personal estate had crossed $200 million. He had done it methodically, without fanfare, the same way he'd done everything since he was a boy, sitting at the kitchen table doing math problems for fun, while his brother Lucas threw a football against the side of the house. Lucas. I try not to think about Lucas too much. That grief is older, harder, calcified in a way that Ethan's grief hasn't had the chance to become yet. Lucas died at 31. A car accident on a November night, rain, a curve in the road, a truck driver who fell asleep. We buried him in the spring when the ground finally thawed, and I thought losing Lucas was the most pain I could ever hold inside my body. I was wrong about that too. Ethan came to see me 6 weeks before he died. He drove himself, which surprised me. He'd been having treatments, and I knew the fatigue was getting bad. I'd offered to come to him, had offered 3 times, and 3 times he'd told me he was fine, that the medication was working, that I worried too much. And then on a Tuesday morning in early October, I heard his car in the driveway. He looked thinner than the last time. He had Ethan's eyes still, my eyes. The coal grey, but there were shadows under them that didn't belong to the boy I'd raised. I made coffee. I put out the lemon cookies he'd liked since he was 7. He sat at the kitchen table, and he looked at his cup for a long moment before he spoke. "Mom," he said, "I need to tell you some things." I sat across from him. I kept my hands still. I did not reach for his hands the way I wanted to, because I could see he was trying to be measured about this, and I wanted to let him be. "I've changed my will," he said. "I've set up a trust structure. Harrington, my attorney, he has all the paperwork." "Okay, I said. It's complicated, he said. The way it's written, you have authority, you're the trustee, not Vanessa. I remember the way the refrigerator hummed in the quiet that followed. Ethan, I need you to hear me, he said. I'm not doing this to hurt her. I'm doing this because I built something and I need it to be protected by someone I trust absolutely. He paused. I don't have a long list of people like that. She's your wife, I said, and I heard how careful my own voice was. I know, he said. And he didn't say anything else for a moment, just looked at his coffee. Promise me, Mom. Promise me you'll protect what I built, whatever happens, whatever you find out, whatever anyone tells you, you protect it. And I said yes. That is the word that started everything. Yes. He died 11 days later. The official cause was cardiac arrest, a complication of the cancer he'd been treating for 14 months. He was in the hospital when it happened, which was supposed to make it better, supposed to mean it was peaceful, monitored, expected. People kept saying that to me afterward. At least he was in good hands. At least he wasn't alone. At least you had time to say goodbye. Vanessa called me from the hospital at 2:47 in the morning. I remember because I was awake. I had been awake for 3 hours by then. That particular insomnia that arrives when your body knows something your mind won't accept yet. Margaret, she said, her voice was wet. He's gone. I said, I'll be there in 40 minutes. I drove there alone. I didn't call anyone. I just drove. Vanessa was in a private waiting room off the cardiac unit, wrapped in a hospital blanket, her makeup half gone, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was 32, almost 33, and even in grief. Even at 3 in the morning, in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. She was the kind of beautiful that people noticed. She stood up when she saw me and came across the room and put her arms around me and cried against my shoulder. I held her. Of course I held her. She was my son's wife, but even then, even in that moment, which should have been only grief and nothing else, something small and cold settled in the back of my mind, something I didn't have a name for yet. The days after the funeral were a particular kind of chaos. Ethan had been moderately well known in tech circles, and Neurabridge had enough profile that the obituaries ran in places beyond Austin. The Journal, a couple of tech publications, even a brief mention in one of the national papers. There were flowers, there were phone calls, there were people I barely knew showing up at the door with food I couldn't eat. Vanessa was present for all of it, but she was present in a specific way, poised, composed, receiving condolences with a graceful sorrow that read well. She wore black that fit her perfectly. She said the right things. She cried at the right moments. She held my hand during the reception at the house and leaned her head briefly against my shoulder when the speeches got hard to hear. She was doing everything correctly, and I told myself, this is grief. People perform grief. There is no right way and no wrong way, and she loved him and she is hurting. I told myself that. I almost believed it. It was 3 weeks after the funeral, 3 weeks almost to the day, when Vanessa sat across from me in her living room, Ethan's living room, the house they'd shared for 4 years, and said the words that split my world clean down the middle. Margaret, she said, I have something to tell you. I'm pregnant. I have run that moment through my mind so many times since then. I have turned it over the way you turn something damaged in your hands, looking for the place where it cracked. I remember the light in the room, afternoon light, weak October sun through the tall windows. I remember the coffee table between us, the photo of Ethan on the mantelpiece behind her head, his face young in that photo, maybe 30, before the company was everything it became. I remember that I was holding a cup of tea that had gone cold. Pregnant, I repeated. Yes. She touched her stomach, a gesture so practiced it barely registered. I found out last week I needed to be sure before I told you. How far along? 6 weeks. A pause. Maybe 7. I have my first appointment on Thursday. I looked at her face. I looked very carefully. And what I saw was something that troubled me in a way I couldn't articulate. Not grief, or not only grief, What I saw was calculation, the particular stillness of someone who has planned what they're about to say and is watching to see how it lands. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I was already looking at her through the wrong lens by then. Maybe it was just a mother projecting her loss onto the only person left to blame. I've asked myself that. I've asked it honestly, but I don't think so, not anymore. I stopped, started again. Ethan must have been so happy. Something shifted in her eyes, almost imperceptible. He was, she said. We both were. Did he know? Of course. I nodded. I put my cold tea down on the table. I said, we should talk about what you need, whether you want to stay in this house or... I want to stay, she said immediately. This is our home. This was Ethan's home. I want the baby to grow up here. Of course, I said. But in the car driving home, I pulled over on a quiet street 6 blocks from my house, and I sat there for 15 minutes with my hands in my lap, staring at nothing. 6 weeks along. Ethan had been in the hospital, often inpatient, for the final 2 months of his illness. The treatments had been aggressive, the side effects bad enough that there were weeks when he could barely sit up. We had talked on the phone almost every day toward the end. I had been to see him twice a week, sometimes 3 times. 6 weeks along. I ran the numbers the way no mother should have to run them, and when I finished running them, I sat very still and I thought, I hope I'm wrong. I genuinely, desperately hope I am wrong. I didn't go to Harrington right away. Edward Harrington had been Ethan's attorney for 8 years, and he had called me the week after the funeral to explain what Ethan had set in motion. The trust structure, my authority as trustee, the various accounts and holdings and subsidiary entities that made up the estate. It was complex. It was deliberately complex, I understood later, because Ethan had been meticulous, and because he had wanted to make certain that the complexity would create space between intention and access. What it meant practically was this. Vanessa could not touch the 200 million without my involvement. She had access to a marital account, a healthy account, a generous one, but the core of the estate, the Neurobridge shares, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio, was locked behind a trust that I controlled. Vanessa knew this. She had been told, and she had said very little about it, which at the time I took for grief-stunned acceptance. Later, I would understand the silence differently. She wasn't accepting it. She was waiting. The first real crack appeared not from anything Vanessa said, but from something she posted. Ethan had been dead for exactly 1 month when she launched what I can only describe as a grief campaign. Though I wouldn't have used those words at the time, she created a public account, documented her pregnancy, spoke about Ethan in beautifully composed captions alongside professionally lit photographs. She gave an interview to a lifestyle publication about carrying on after unimaginable loss. She appeared on a podcast about grief and entrepreneurship. In 8 weeks, she had 300,000 followers. I am not a person who is suspicious of social media by nature. I understand that people grieve differently, that some people process publicly, that there is nothing inherently wrong with sharing pain. But there was something about the precision of it, the timing, the photographs, the way each post built a particular narrative that made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't dismiss. She was positioning herself. The story she was building was devoted wife, suddenly widowed, carrying the air of a visionary. It was a powerful story. It was a story that would make any reasonable person sympathetic, any reasonable trustee. I just wasn't certain it was true. It was Ethan's old assistant, a quiet young man named Danny Park, who said the first real thing to me. Danny had worked with Ethan for 5 years. He'd been at the funeral, had sat in the back row and left quickly after, and I had seen his face during the service. The raw, uncomplicated grief of someone who genuinely loved the person they worked for, which is rarer than it should be. I ran into him 3 weeks later at a coffee shop near Neurobridge's offices, and he looked startled to see me, and then he looked like he was making a decision. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "can I?" "Can we sit for a minute?" We sat. He wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked at the table. He said, "I don't want to overstep." "Danny," I said, "I am 61 years old and I have been lied to enough times to know when someone is trying to protect me from something. Please don't." He looked up. "Did Ethan tell you that he and Vanessa that things weren't good at the end? Before the diagnosis even?" "He didn't say much about their marriage," I said carefully. "They were fighting," Danny said. "Not in the office, but I drove him places sometimes when he couldn't drive himself, and he'd get off calls and he shook his head. He wasn't happy. I don't think I'm breaking a confidence to say that because I think you need to know." "Did he say why?" "Not in so many words," Danny paused, "but there was a night, maybe 8 months before he got sick. We were working late and he'd had a drink, which he almost never did. And he said, 'Danny, when a person shows you exactly who they are, you have to decide whether you're willing to see it.' He didn't explain. He just said it and went back to work. I drove home from that coffee shop with Danny's words sitting in my chest like a stone. When a person shows you exactly who they are. What had Ethan seen? What had he decided he was willing to see? And what had he chosen to protect himself from seeing? I went to see Edward Harrington that week. His office was downtown, a good firm, understated in the way that expensive things often are. He was a careful man, not warm exactly, but precise in a way I had always found reassuring. He shook my hand and offered me water and waited. "Ed," I said, "I want to understand the full scope of what Ethan built, not the summary you gave me last month, the detail." He looked at me for a moment. "Is there something specific you're concerned about?" "Not yet," I said. "I want to know what I'm protecting before I have to protect it." He nodded slowly, and we spent 2.5 hours going through it. The Neurobridge shares, the subsidiary companies, the real estate portfolio in 3 states, the investment accounts, the intellectual property. $214 million when you added it all together, a number so large it barely felt like money anymore. It felt like architecture, like something structural. At the end, I said, "What happens to Noah, to Vanessa's child, if the child is Ethan's?" Harrington looked at his hands. "Under the current trust structure, a biological child of Ethan's would be a designated beneficiary. There are provisions. And if the child isn't Ethan's?" A long pause. "Then those provisions would not apply." I left his office and stood on the sidewalk in the October cold and breathed until my heart stopped hammering. Then I took out my phone and called a private investigator. Easy. His name was Ray Cable. He came recommended through a roundabout chain. A lawyer friend of Harrington's who had used him in a corporate matter, who described him as thorough and discreet, which were the only 2 adjectives I needed. He was younger than I expected, 40 maybe. He came to my house, which I appreciated. I didn't want to be seen walking into a PI's office. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Ethan had made his promise. And he took notes in a small notebook, and he didn't react to anything I said, which was also something I appreciated. "I need to know," I told him, "whether my daughter-in-law was faithful to my son." He wrote something down. "Time frame you're interested in?" "The last 1.5 years of his life." "Understood. I need this done quietly. I need nothing to get back to her." "That's standard," he said. "Discretion is the product." After he left, I sat at the table for a long time. I was not proud of what I was doing. I want to be clear about that. There was no part of me that felt righteous sitting in that chair. I felt like a woman who had been backed into a corner and was now doing the only thing left to do, and that is a very different feeling. But I had made a promise, and I intended to keep it. It took Ray 4 weeks to bring me what he found. I want to tell you those 4 weeks were quiet, but they weren't. Vanessa had reached out to Harrington directly, asking for clarification on the trust structure, what she could access and when. Harrington had called me to tell me, and I had said, "Tell her we're still in the review process." And Harrington had paused and said, "That's accurate technically." And I had said, "Good." She also called me twice that month. Wants to talk about the baby, the appointment, the due date, late June, they were saying. Wants to ask if I wanted to come over for dinner, a quiet night. She was trying to take care of herself. She missed family. I went to dinner. I brought flowers. Yellow ones, because yellow was the only color that didn't feel like a statement. We sat at the dining room table. She had shared with my son, and she made pasta and talked about the pregnancy and showed me the first ultrasound photograph. And I said all the right things. I said how wonderful. And he would have been so proud. And I touched the photograph with steady hands, and I did not let my face tell her anything. I went home and I stood in my bathroom for 10 minutes before I could look at myself in the mirror. This is what it costs to keep a promise, I thought. This is what it looks like. Ray Cable came back on a Wednesday. He sat at my kitchen table again. He laid a folder in front of me. Photographs, records, a small document that I came to understand was a summary report. He was careful and quiet about it, not unkind. There was a man, he said. His name is Marco Whitfield. She was seeing him beginning roughly 20 months ago. The relationship, based on what I was able to document, continued until at least 7 months ago. I looked at the photographs. I will not describe them in detail because there is nothing useful in that. I will say only that they were unambiguous. 7 months ago, I said. My voice came out very level. I was grateful for the levelness. That's the last documented contact I could verify. 7 months ago. Ethan had been sick by then, in the thick of treatment, some of the hardest months. And she had been. Thank you, I said. Thank you, Ray. He looked at me with something that might have been pity, might have been respect, might have been both at once. Are you all right, Mrs. Cole? I will be, I said. He left. I sat at the table with the folder in front of me and I thought about Ethan's hands, how he used to make things with his hands when he was small, build things, take things apart to see how they worked. I thought about the whiteboard in his apartment in Austin. I thought about the last time I had seen him, the cookies I'd put out, the way he'd looked at his coffee cup before he could look at me. Whatever you find out, he had said, had he known, had he suspected, had he been protecting me from the knowing or protecting himself? I thought about how alone he must have been at the end, carrying all of that, sick and scared and brilliant and completely alone with a secret he couldn't share. And I thought, all right, my love, I have you. The DNA test was not simple to arrange. There were legal considerations. There were ethical ones, the kind that keep you awake at 3 a.m, rearranging themselves no matter how many times you've resolved them. Harrington helped, quietly, off the books in the sense that we kept it between us until there was something concrete to act on. He had done this before, not often, but enough. What I can tell you is that by the time Vanessa's son was born, on a rainy evening in late June, 6 pounds 11 ounces, a full head of dark hair, absolutely perfect in the way that new babies are absolutely perfect and terrifying. I had already put the machinery in motion. I was there for the birth. Vanessa had asked me to be, and I had come. And I had held her hand during the hard parts, and when the baby came and cried, his first outraged cry, I felt something crack open in my chest that I was completely unprepared for. He was real. He was here. He was a Cole. He had the Cole jaw already, some ghost of it in that tiny new face. But which Cole? That was the question I was still waiting to answer. She named him Noah James Hale Cole. I held him in my arms while Vanessa slept that first night, and he made the small, unconscious movements that newborns make, the startle reflex, the rooting, the fists curled tight as secrets. He smelled the way all babies smell, like something new that the world hasn't touched yet. Tell me who you are, I thought. Tell me what you cost. He couldn't tell me anything. He just breathed. The results came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Noah was born. Harrington called me. Not emailed, called. I knew from that alone what it was going to be. Margaret, he said, the test came back. Tell me, I said, a pause. The child is not Ethan's biological son. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something in the yard. I could hear my own heartbeat in a way that was almost interesting from a distance. Are you sure? I said, which was a stupid question, and I knew it even as I asked it. The lab is certain, Ed said. I'm sorry, Margaret. Don't be, I said. I asked for the truth. I got the truth. I hung up. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen, which is something I have not done since I was a child, and I pressed my back against the cabinet, and I put my face in my hands. Not because I was surprised, but because confirmation is its own kind of blow, even when you've been preparing for it, even when you've told yourself you were ready, even when part of you has known for months. Knowing doesn't immunize you against the pain of having it confirmed. I cried then, properly, the way I hadn't let myself cry since the hospital, since the waiting room, since Vanessa's arms around my shoulders, and the antiseptic smell, and the paper cup of coffee I didn't drink. I cried for Ethan. I cried for Lucas. I cried for Noah, who was 3 weeks old and had no idea what kind of world he'd been born into. And then I stood up, because there was more coming. There was one more result I had asked for. The secondary test, the deeper analysis, and that result, that one, was going to change everything again. I just didn't know it yet. The full truth, when it arrived, was something I had not imagined in even my darkest moments of suspicion. It arrived not with Harrington's careful voice on the phone, but in a document, 8 pages, technical language that I had to read 3 times before it settled into meaning. Noah was not Ethan's son, but the DNA markers told a different story than I had expected. The child was still a Cole. And the name attached to the other half of that genetic signature was one I had not heard spoken aloud in 4 years. Lucas. My Lucas. Gone since 2019, buried in the spring, mourned and grieved and carried and never expected to reach forward from that grave and upend the living. I read the page, I turned it over, I read it again, and I understood finally why Vanessa had been waiting. She had known from the beginning exactly what she was carrying, and she had never planned to tell me. I did not call Vanessa that day. I did not call her the next day either, or the day after that. I folded the 8-page report into thirds, put it inside the copy of Middlemarch on my bedroom shelf, the one nobody ever touched, and I went about my life with the kind of deliberate, mechanical normalcy that I had perfected over 61 years of being a woman who does not fall apart in public. I watered my plants, I went to the grocery store, I made soup I ate half of. I slept badly and did not tell anyone. What I needed before I did anything else, before I made a single move or said a single word, was to understand, not just the fact of it, the bare genetic fact, the cold laboratory truth, but the how, the when, the architecture of a deception this specific, this deliberate, this deeply strange. Because here is what I kept coming back to in those 3 days of silence. Preserved genetic material doesn't just appear. It doesn't happen by accident. Someone had to make a decision. Someone had to plan, had to arrange, had to carry that plan through not just once, but across months or years. Someone had to look at a future they wanted and decide that the most direct path to it ran straight through a dead man, my dead son, my Lucas, who had been in the ground for 4 years. I thought about him constantly in those days, more than I had in a long time, which felt like its own particular cruelty. Lucas had been the loud one, the physical one, the boy who came home with grass stains and stories and a laugh you could hear from 2 rooms away. He and Ethan had been close in the way that brothers are when they are different enough not to compete, but similar enough to understand each other. They had been each other's counterweight. When Lucas died, something in Ethan went very quiet. He threw himself into Neurobridge the way some people throw themselves into water. Not to swim exactly, but to get somewhere other than where they were. I never knew that Lucas and Vanessa had any history. That is the thing I could not fit into any framework I had. I had replayed every memory I held of the two of them together. Holidays, the occasional dinner, Ethan's company events where Vanessa had occasionally come, and I could not find a single moment that had registered as wrong. They had been cordial, friendly even. Lucas had liked her, I thought. He'd said once, years before he died, that Ethan had done well for himself, which from Lucas was high praise. But there had been something else, something underneath the cordial. I just hadn't known to look for it. And now Lucas was gone, and Ethan was gone, and Vanessa was in a house that had once been filled with both of them, nursing a baby that carried my name and her secret, and she had not told me. She had not told me. She had sat across from me at dinner tables and held my hand at a funeral and cried on my shoulder in a hospital waiting room. And she had not told me. That was the part that kept catching in my throat like something sharp. Not the deception itself, as monstrous as it was, but the intimacy of it. The way she had looked me in the eyes over and chosen to keep going. On the fourth day, I called Ray Cable. "I need more," I said without preamble. "Mrs. Cole." He sounded unsurprised. "What specifically?" "Vanessa and my son Lucas, before his death. I need to know what was between them, okay? When, how long, and whether anyone else knew." A pause. "That's going back further." "I know. It'll take time." "Take the time," I said. "Do it right." After I hung up, I sat with my hands flat on the kitchen table and I thought, Ethan, did you know about Lucas? Did you know what she'd been before she was yours? And I didn't have an answer. I thought about Danny Park's words, when a person shows you exactly who they are. And I wondered if that had been about Marco Whitfield, or if it had been about something else entirely. Something older, something Ethan had discovered and made a decision about, a quiet, painful, private decision that he had never shared with me because he had spent his whole life protecting me from the things he couldn't fix. Even at the end, even when he was dying, even then he had tried to protect me. I pressed my palms flat against the table until the pressure ached, and I said out loud, to no one, to the empty kitchen, to maybe just the air that had once held my sons inside it, "I've got it. I promise." The words sounded different the second time, less like comfort, more like armor. Ray came back to me in pieces over the next 2.5 weeks, which was the most difficult waiting I had ever done, including waiting for biopsy results, including waiting at that hospital on the night Ethan died. At least in those moments, I'd known what I was waiting for. This time I was waiting for the shape of something I couldn't yet see, and the not knowing had a particular weight to it that wore on me in ways I didn't fully register until later. I stopped sleeping past 4. Started losing weight I hadn't intended to lose, found myself standing in rooms without any memory of why I'd walked into them. But I kept my appointments, I answered my calls. When Vanessa texted me photos of Noah, and she did regularly, with a warmth that I now read as strategic maintenance, I responded with the appropriate enthusiasm. "He looks so much like Ethan," I wrote once. And then I put my phone face down on the counter and stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists until my pulse slowed. She wrote back, "I know, it helps. I did not respond to that one." The first piece Ray gave me came on a phone call. Vanessa and Lucas had known each other before Ethan. They had been together, actually together dating, for approximately 8 months before Lucas died. The relationship had not been public, which Ray said was notable given that Lucas had generally been open about who he was seeing. It was the kind of thing that suggested either embarrassment or intentional concealment. "Why concealed?" I asked. "Could be a lot of things," Ray said. "One possibility. She was already connected to Ethan's world by then. There's overlap in the timeline. It's possible she was moving from one to the other." I heard what he was saying underneath the careful language. I heard it very clearly. "Or both," I said. "That's possible too," Ray said quietly. I sat with that for the rest of the day. The idea that she had moved from Lucas to Ethan, or had been in both their orbits simultaneously, was ugly enough on its own. But what lived underneath that, what I couldn't stop turning over, was the question of what Lucas had meant to her, whether it had been real or whether he had always been just an approach vector, an entryway into a world she'd wanted access to, whether my boy had died without knowing that, and whether that was something I could ever forgive. The second piece came in person. Ray set up a meeting. Not at my house this time, at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop far enough from Vanessa's neighborhood that the chance of being seen was minimal. He brought a second folder, thinner than the first, and he laid it on the table with the same careful hands and the same absence of dramatics that I had come to appreciate about him. "I found someone," and he said, "a woman named Claire Sato. She was a friend of Vanessa's. They've been estranged for about 2 years now. She was willing to talk." About what? About what Vanessa did with Lucas's genetic material. The coffee shop had music playing, something soft and forgettable, and it suddenly felt very far away. "Tell me," I said. What Claire Sato had told Ray in a 2-hour conversation that Ray had recorded with her consent was this. Lucas and Vanessa had talked during their relationship about the future. They had been serious enough in those 8 months that certain things had been said, things about children, about building something together, about permanence. And when Lucas had received a health scare the year before he died, a false alarm it turned out, but frightening enough that he'd taken it seriously, he had made a decision. He had arranged for the preservation of genetic material, a private clinic, quietly done. He told Vanessa, Pierre Ray said. She was the only person he told. "And after he died," I said, and my voice came out completely flat, "she never disclosed the existence of the preserved material," Ray said. "She maintained access to the account at the clinic. Claire said Vanessa talked about it once, only once, several years ago, and said that it felt like the last piece of Lucas she had left. Claire thought she meant it sentimentally. She meant it as an option," I said. Ray looked at me steadily. "It appears that way." I looked at my coffee cup. I hadn't touched it. "When did she use it?" 14 months ago, Ray said. 6 months into your son Ethan's illness. 6 months into his illness, when the prognosis had become something that a person with access to certain information might begin to factor into their calculations. When the landscape of what Ethan's estate would eventually become was growing clearer by the month. I thought about Vanessa sitting across from me 3 weeks after the funeral, touching her stomach and saying 6 weeks, maybe 7. I thought about how composed she had been, how perfectly sad she had planned this, not impulsively, not out of grief or desperation or confusion. She had made a plan and she had executed it, and she had come to that meeting with me with the whole thing already done. "Ray," I said, "does she know that you've spoken to Claire?" "No," he said. "Claire reached out to me actually. She had her own, she had reasons." "What kind of reasons?" He paused. "She said that Vanessa told her, around the time Noah was born, that she was holding all the cards now. And Claire said she thought about that phrase for 3 weeks before she called me, holding all the cards. I let that settle. I let it sit in the place where my anger lived, that quiet room I'd been keeping very locked and very controlled. And I felt the lock strain for the first time. She thought she was holding all the cards. She thought the baby made her untouchable. She thought the Cole bloodline. Even through Lucas, even through a plan engineered in secret and executed over 14 months while my surviving son was dying, made her untouchable. She had not counted on me. And that was the first moment I felt something other than grief. Something other than exhaustion and sorrow, and the particular loneliness of a woman who is carrying a secret she can't yet share. What I felt was resolve, not anger, not yet. Something colder than anger and more useful, the absolute crystalline conviction that I was going to see this through. I need to tell you about Edward Harrington's face when I laid everything in front of him. He is, as I have said, a careful man, a precise man. In 8 years of being Ethan's attorney, he had probably seen the full spectrum of human behavior in the context of money and death, which is to say, he had seen plenty. I expected him to be measured. I expected him to be clinical. He wasn't entirely. He read the documents. He looked at Ray's summary report. He read the 8-page genetic analysis again. Slowly, the way you read something when you can't quite make yourself accept what the words are saying. And when he looked up at me, something had shifted in his face that I recognized because I had felt the same thing. The specific, disorienting shock of a narrative that had seemed to have 4 walls and a ceiling, suddenly opening up into something with no clear shape. "The child is Lucas's son," he said. "Yes, through preserved material. Yes, that she arranged to use." He stopped, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "Margaret, does she know that you know?" "No." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside his window, the city moved around. People going places, doing ordinary things, living in a world where the story they thought was true was still the story that was true. I almost envied them. "All right," he said finally. "Let's talk about what this means legally, because he stopped again. "It's genuinely complicated, in ways I want to be very precise about before either of us says anything definitive." "Take your time," I said. "I'm not in a hurry." That was not entirely true, but it was the right thing to say. What Edward walked me through over the next hour and a half was a landscape I hadn't fully anticipated. Vanessa had not, technically, done anything illegal in using the preserved genetic material. The arrangements had been made between 2 consenting adults. The clinic had operated within its protocols. The decisions about access had been made by Lucas while he was alive. Whether the secrecy of it constituted fraud in a legal sense was a more complicated question, one that depended on jurisdiction and on exactly what her intentions could be proven to be. "The trust," I said. "What does this change?" "Significantly," Aunt Edward said. "The provisions for a biological child of Ethan's. Those do not apply to Noah. The DNA is unambiguous on that point. However," he paused, "there is a separate question of what Noah's actual legal status is as a member of the Cole family. Through Lucas, he is your grandson. That creates moral and potentially legal obligations that exist independent of Ethan's estate." "I know," I said. "I've thought about that." He looked at me carefully. "How much?" "Enough to know that I'm not going to simply cut her off and pretend the child doesn't exist," I said. "He didn't choose any of this. He's a baby. He's my grandson through Lucas, and that is real regardless of everything else." Edward nodded slowly. That's a reasonable position, a generous one." "It's not generous, Aunt," I said. "It's just true. Noah is not responsible for what Vanessa did. He's a person. He's going to grow up to be a person, and he's going to need to know who his father was and who his family is, and he deserves to have that. He deserves to have that even if his mother doesn't deserve anything from me at all." Something shifted in Edward's expression. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. Maybe respect, maybe just the look of a man recalibrating. "Then what is it you want to do, he asked. "I want to know everything I'm entitled to do," I said. "And then I want to decide." Ethan. What I did not expect, what I genuinely had not prepared myself for, was the conversation that happened before I could do anything formal. It was Vanessa who called it, which should have warned me in retrospect. Vanessa had always been better at the social chess of things than I had given her credit for. And in the months since Noah was born, she had been running a very deliberate game. The photographs, the updates, the warm texts, the dinner invitation she'd extended twice. She was maintaining me, keeping me close and warm and feeling like family while the larger question of the trust remained unresolved. She called on a Friday afternoon and asked if she could come over. "Just us," she said. "I've been wanting to talk and I think it's time. I said yes, because I had learned, slowly at significant personal cost, that the worst thing I could do now was seem guarded, seem like I knew, give her any reason to move, to call her own lawyers, to take any kind of preemptive action before I was ready. She arrived at 6 o'clock in the evening without Noah. He was with a sitter, she said. She'd wanted her hands free. She was dressed simply. No jewelry except her wedding ring, which she still wore, which still struck me every time I saw it. She looked tired in a real way, a way that new mothers look tired, and I registered that with the complicated double vision I'd been living with for months, the part of me that saw her as a mother, exhausted and real and in some genuine way alone, and the part of me that knew what she had done. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. She wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at me for a moment before she spoke. And what I saw in her face in that moment was something that surprised me. Not the composed performance I'd expected, not the calculated sympathy, something messier than that, something that looked, in spite of everything, like fear. I need to tell you something, she said. I kept my face still. All right. About Noah. She looked down. About who he is. The kitchen hummed. Somewhere outside, a car moved past. I felt my heartbeat in my hands. I'm listening, I said. She looked up and her eyes were wet. Not the careful, photogenic tears I'd watched her deploy at Ethan's funeral, but the raw, ugly, surprised kind. The kind that arrive before you can manage them. He's not Ethan's, she said. And there it was, the thing she had carried for over a year, the weight of it, whatever weight it had, finally spoken aloud in my kitchen. I did not move. I did not say I know. I did not tell her about Ray Cable or Claire Sarter or the 8-page report in my bedroom shelf. I sat still, and I waited, and I let her say it. I know, she said, voice fracturing on the second word. I know what that means. I know what you're going to think of me. I know. She stopped, pressed her hand over her mouth, breathed. He's Lucas's. I used, Lucas had material preserved before he died, and another stop. I know how that sounds. How does it sound? I asked, quietly, carefully. She looked at me, and the fracture in her voice spread to her eyes, to her whole face. Like I used a dead man, she said, please see. Like I calculated everything. Like I'm a monster. There was a silence in which I could have said many things. I chose. Tell me the truth about Lucas. She looked at her cup. For a moment, I thought she was going to manage herself back into composure, retreat behind the careful version of herself I'd been dealing with for months, but she didn't. I loved him, she said. I know you won't believe me, but I genuinely loved him, and when he died, I fell apart in ways I never let anyone see. I met Ethan at one of the worst periods of my life, and he was kind, and he was steady, and She stopped. I don't know if I loved Ethan the way I loved Lucas. I think I loved who Ethan was. I loved what he made me feel like. Safe. I hadn't felt safe in a long time. But you kept the material, I said. I couldn't let it go, she said. It was the last thing. I know that sounds. And then Ethan got sick. She went very still. And you looked at what was coming, I said. And I kept my voice steady, kept it level, because I had not survived this year by losing my steadiness now. And you made a decision. She didn't say no. She said, I was scared. Of what? Of being alone, she said. Of having nothing left. Ethan's family and you had the trust. I had 4 years of marriage and a man who I think at the end knew I had never been entirely his. And I was terrified that when he died, I would be left with nothing and no one, and nobody would ever... She stopped again, put her face in her hands. I know that doesn't make it right. No, I said, it doesn't. Margaret. She looked up. Her face was a wreck and she didn't try to fix it. Noah is your grandson. Whatever you think of me, he's yours too. He has Lucas's blood. He has Cole blood. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to... I know what you're asking, I said, and I did. She was asking me to choose the child over the anger, to let the blood matter more than the betrayal. to be, in the end, a grandmother first and a wounded woman second. It was not an unfair ask. It was also not the whole story, and we both knew it. "Vanessa," I said, "you came here tonight. That matters. But I need you to understand that whatever happens next, I will not be managed. I will not be positioned. I will not be handled like a problem you're trying to contain." She blinked. Something in her face shifted. The tears still there, but something more awake underneath. You have been building a narrative for months," I said. "The social accounts, the media presence, the grief made public in very specific ways. You've been making yourself sympathetic and documented and untouchable, and I have watched every step of it, and I need you to know that I have watched every step of it." She was very quiet now. "I am Noah's grandmother," I said. "That is true, and it is not going away, and I am not walking away from that child who did not choose any of this. But I'm also Ethan's mother, and I made him a promise that I intend to keep. And you," I stopped, made myself breathe. "You are the person who looked my dying son in the face and kept this secret. And I need time to know what to do with that." The kitchen was very quiet. Vanessa sat across the table with her hands around her cup and her face open in a way I had never seen before. Stripped of the performance, stripped of the strategy, just a 33-year-old woman in the kitchen of a woman who held everything she needed and wasn't going to simply hand it over. She looked young, suddenly, young and frightened, and I didn't want to feel it. I actively resisted feeling it, very alone. "Okay," she said finally. Her voice was small. "Okay," I said. Neither of us touched our tea. Outside, the neighborhood had gone quiet the way neighborhoods go quiet in the early evening. That particular in-between stillness when the day has ended, but the night hasn't fully come. I heard a dog somewhere. I heard the tick of my kitchen clock, which I had stopped noticing years ago. "I'll call you," I said. "I need a few days." She nodded. She got up, she picked up her bag, and she stood by the door for a moment, and she looked at me with an expression that I have never quite been able to name. Not gratitude, not relief, not contrition, but something that contained elements of all three and was messier and more human than any of them. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what it's worth." "It's worth something," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me. "I just don't know yet what." She left. I locked the door. I stood in my kitchen alone, and I listened to the sounds of the house settling around me. I thought about Ethan. I thought about Lucas. I thought about Noah, 6 weeks old and asleep somewhere with a sitter, dreaming the uncomplicated dreams of infants who don't know yet that the world is complicated. I thought about the promise. Whatever you find out, whatever anyone tells you, you protect it, and I thought I will. But I'm going to have to figure out exactly what that means. Because protecting what Ethan built, I was beginning to understand, was not simply a question of money or legal structures or trust documents. It was a question of what I was willing to carry, what weight I could absorb and still stand upright, what kind of woman I was going to be in the aftermath of all of this, when the grief had settled and the shock had faded, and what remained was just the life I had to keep living. I was 61 years old. I had buried 2 sons, and I was standing in a kitchen that still smelled faintly like the lemon cookies Ethan had not finished eating, making a decision about the future of a family that was smaller and stranger and more broken than I had ever imagined mine would be. I turned off the kitchen light. I went to bed. I did not sleep. The few days I'd asked for became 10. I did not call Vanessa. She did not call me, which told me she had more self-control than I had given her credit for, or that she had been coached by someone, which was a possibility I filed away without acting on. I received one text from her on the 4th day, a photograph of Noah asleep in a patch of afternoon sunlight with his fist pressed against his cheek. No caption, just the photograph. I looked at it for a long time. He had Lucas's ears. I hadn't noticed that before, or maybe I hadn't let myself notice it, because noticing would have required acknowledging something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. But there it was, clear in the afternoon light, the slight point at the top, the shape of the lobe. Lucas had had those ears since he was an infant. I had photographs somewhere buried in albums in the spare room closet of Lucas at 6 weeks old with that exact same fist pressed against that exact same cheek. I put my phone down and I went to the spare room and I pulled out the albums and I sat on the floor for 2 hours, which is something I seem to be doing more often lately. Sitting on floors, losing track of time, letting the ordinary world do without me for a while. I looked at every photograph of Lucas I had, and then I looked at every photograph of Ethan. And I thought about what it meant that both of my sons had loved, or been loved by, or been used by. I still didn't know the precise word, the same woman. I thought about what it meant that Lucas had trusted her with the most private decision he'd ever made, and Ethan had built an empire and chosen at the end to protect it from her. 2 brothers, 2 entirely different responses to the same person. One had opened his hands, one had slowly, quietly closed his. Which of them had understood her better? I still don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure I ever will. What I knew, sitting on that floor with the album spread around me, was that the 10 days of silence had done something useful. They had moved me past the first blinding layer of the shock, the raw impossibility of it, the how dare she fury that had been pressing against the inside of my chest since that kitchen conversation, and into something more useful, something I recognized as the particular clarity that comes when grief has been metabolized enough to see past it. I was not going to make a decision from anger. Anger was easy. Anger was available. There was more than enough material for it. But Ethan had not asked me to be angry. He had asked me to be smart. So I called Edward Harrington and I said, I'm ready. Let's talk about what we're actually going to do. The meeting with Edward lasted 3 hours and produced 11 pages of notes, which I took in my own handwriting because I have never trusted my memory enough not to write things down. What emerged from those 3 hours was a picture more complicated than any simple version of justice or punishment could accommodate, and I want to try to lay it out the way Edward laid it out for me because I think it matters. The trust, Ethan's trust. The structure he had built so carefully around the $214 million was unambiguous in one crucial respect. Control resided with me as trustee, and the provisions for a biological child of Ethan's did not apply to Noah. That part was clear. That part, Edward said, would hold up, regardless of what Vanessa argued, or who she hired, or what story she chose to tell. But there were other questions that didn't have clean answers. The house, for instance. The house was technically marital property and Vanessa had legitimate claim to a share of it. The marital account, the generous, healthy account Ethan had designated for household access, was hers by right. A portion of the estate, separate from the trust, existed in a form that standard spousal inheritance law would touch regardless of what the trust said. None of this was small money. Even without access to the core of the estate, Vanessa would not be destitute. She would not be a woman who couldn't care for her child. She would simply not be the woman who controlled $200 million of an AI company. That was the distinction, and it was not a small one. What's her likely move? I asked Edward. He leaned back in his chair. Contest. She'll argue that the trust terms are invalid, that as surviving spouse she has rights the trust can't extinguish, that the DNA evidence was obtained improperly. Was it? He gave me a measured look. Obtained through means that are legally ambiguous. The results themselves are scientifically valid. Whether the method of obtaining them creates an evidentiary problem depends on her legal team and what they want to argue. So she could fight this. She could fight this, he agreed, and it would be expensive and slow and very public. Public. There was the word that sat in the room with a particular weight. Because Vanessa had 300,000 people watching her, She had a carefully built narrative. Devoted widow, grieving mother, carrying the legacy forward. If this went to court, if the DNA results became part of public record, if the story of Lucas's preserved genetic material came out, if the specifics of what she had done were laid out in documents that reporters could request and publish, the narrative would shatter. But it would shatter loudly, and a loud shattering is very different from a quiet resolution. And one of those things is something a 61-year-old woman with 2 dead sons can survive with her dignity intact, and the other one is not. I thought about that for a long moment. Is there a version of this, Hawish? I said slowly, where we don't go to court? Edward looked at me. You mean a negotiated settlement? I mean a conversation, I said, before lawyers and filings and depositions, a real conversation where she knows that I know everything and we figure out what this actually looks like going forward. He was quiet for a moment. That's a risk, Margaret. If she walks out of that conversation and calls her attorney, I know the risk, I said. Tell me whether it's a viable path. He thought about it, actually thought, not just performed thinking, which was one of the things I valued about him. Then he said, if you go in knowing what your bottom line is, what you will not move on under any circumstances, and she's capable of recognizing that fighting you is going to cost her more than cooperating, then yes, it's viable. What's my bottom line? That's not a question I can answer for you, he said, not unkindly. So I went home and I sat at my kitchen table, the table that had become, over the course of this year, the place where I made every decision that mattered. And I worked it out. What would I not move on? The trust, the core of Neurobridge, the shares, the investment portfolio, the intellectual property. Ethan had built that. It was his life's work, his brilliance. Years of a man sitting at a garage sale whiteboard and thinking harder than most people are capable of thinking. It did not belong to Vanessa. It had never belonged to Vanessa, and Ethan had made that clear before he died. And I was going to honor that if it was the last thing I did. What was I prepared to do? Noah. That was where it got complicated. That was where the bottom line of protection met the reality of a child who had not chosen any of this and who deserved in some fundamental way that I could not argue myself out of, to have something. Not because his mother had manipulated and deceived and planned for years. Despite that, in spite of that. Because he was Lucas's son, and Lucas had loved him into existence even without knowing it. And that counted for something that money could not accurately represent. But money was the only language the law spoke. I wrote 2 words at the top of my notepad: protect. Noah. Then I drew a line between them. Then I picked up my phone and I called Vanessa. She answered on the second ring. Margaret. Her voice had the carefulness of someone who had been waiting for this call and had spent time preparing for it. I'd like to meet, I said. Not at the house, somewhere neutral. A brief pause. When? Tomorrow. Noon. There's a place called Caldwell's on Marsh Street. Do you know it? I can find it. Come alone, I said. I'll be alone. Another pause, slightly longer. Okay, she said, and then, carefully, should I bring a lawyer? You can if you want, I said. But if you do, I'll bring Edward, and then we'll be in a different kind of conversation. She understood what I meant. I'll come alone, she said. I put the phone down. I looked at the 2 words on my notepad. Then I flipped the page over and I wrote, in the careful handwriting I'd been using since 2nd grade, a list of everything I intended to say. I did not sleep well that night, but I slept. That felt like something. Caldwell's was a coffee place, not a restaurant. Small tables, good light, the kind of place where people came to work on laptops and largely left each other alone. I arrived 15 minutes early, which is a habit I have never broken, and I chose a table against the wall where I could see the door. I ordered coffee I actually intended to drink. I put my notepad in my bag and left it there because I had memorized what I needed to say and I did not want the distraction of paper between us. Vanessa came in at noon exactly. She was wearing a grey sweater and no makeup worth mentioning, and she looked honestly like a woman who had also not slept well. She ordered something at the counter and brought it to the table and sat down across from me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The silence had a different quality than the silences we'd shared before. Less performance in it, less management. We were both too tired for the performance by then, I think. "Thank you for coming," I said. "Of course," she said, and then abandoning whatever opening she'd prepared. "Are you going to try to take everything?" The directness startled me. I appreciated it. "No," I said, "I'm not." Something shifted in her face, not relief, not exactly, but the particular unlocking that happens when someone has been braced for a blow, and the blow doesn't land exactly where they expected. "Then what?" "I want to tell you what I know," I said. "All of it. And then I want to tell you what I've decided, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. Can you do that?" She wrapped her hands around her cup, nodded. So I told her. I told her about Ray Cable and what he'd found, and Claire Sato and the conversation. I told her about the secondary genetic test, the 8-page report, the specific findings that had confirmed not just that Noah was not Ethan's, but that he was Lucas's. I told her that I knew about the clinic, that I knew about the timeline, that I knew she had used Lucas's preserved material 6 months into Ethan's illness. In what I considered, and here I kept my voice absolutely level, a deliberate and strategic act. I watched her face as I said it. She did not try to deny any of it. That I will give her. She sat across from me and she took every word, and she did not flinch away from it or construct a counter-narrative in real time. Her jaw tightened once when I mentioned Claire's name, but she stayed. When I finished, the coffee shop hummed around us. Someone at another table was typing very fast. Near the window, 2 young women were laughing about something. "I didn't plan it the way you're describing," Vanessa said. Her voice was quiet and even and honest, in the way that voices get when someone has run out of energy for anything else. "I need you to know that I didn't sit down one day and map it out. It was..." She stopped. "It was messier than that. It was panic and grief and watching Ethan get sicker and lying awake at 3 in the morning thinking about what happened to Lucas and what was happening to Ethan, and feeling like everything I'd tried to build was disappearing at once." "So it was impulse, I said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. "It was desperate," she said, "which is not the same thing as calculated, though I understand that from the outside it looks the same." I thought about that. I actually thought about it instead of simply rejecting it, because one of the things I had decided in those 10 days was that I was going to try, not succeed perfectly, just try to hold space for complexity, even when complexity was uncomfortable, even when it complicated the anger. "Did Ethan know?" I asked. "About you and Lucas, the history." She looked at her cup. "Yes," she said. "He knew we'd been involved. He didn't know what I'd done with the material. I never told him that. But he knew Lucas had loved you." "Yes." "And he married you anyway." "He did." She looked up. I think Ethan believed he could be enough, that what he could offer would be enough. And he was, Margaret, he was remarkable. He was genuinely remarkable, and I did love him. And I am not going to sit here and pretend that our marriage was a transaction, because it wasn't, not entirely. But not entirely not, I said. The words landed. She didn't push them away. "Not entirely not," she repeated softly. "No." We sat with that for a moment. It was painful and it was real, and there was no way to make it less than what it was. Ethan had known on some level that he was loving someone who was also in some partial, unresolved way still grieving his brother. He had chosen to try anyway. He had been remarkable enough to try, and generous enough to keep trying, and private enough to carry the weight of that trying without ever saying a word to me. My chest ached in a way that was separate from anger, just grief. Just the plain, unadorned grief of a mother who keeps learning new dimensions of how alone her son had been. "Okay," I said. "Here is what I've decided. She straightened slightly, both hands around the cup. The trust stands, I said, the Neurobridge shares, the investment portfolio, the real estate, all of it stays under my authority as trustee. That doesn't change. Ethan was explicit and he was right, and I will defend that in court for as long as it takes if you force me to. I held her eyes. Are you hearing me? Yes, she said quietly. The marital account, the house. Those questions have their own legal answers that aren't mine to simply take away. Edward knows what the law provides. I'm not going to fight that. I paused. I'm also not going to make your life impossible. She blinked. Noah is my grandson, I said, and my voice did something I had not entirely prepared for. It moved, just slightly, the way voices move when the thing being said is true, and the truth of it is larger than the sentence can hold. He is Lucas's son. I don't know yet what that means for how we live our lives going forward. I don't know what kind of relationship you and I are capable of having after all of this, but I know I am not going to walk away from that child. Vanessa's eyes were wet. She didn't wipe them. I'm going to set up a protected fund, I said, for Noah, not managed by you, managed by the trust, with Edward as administrator. It will cover his education, his health care, the foundational things a child needs to become whoever he's going to become. It won't be accessed for anything else, and it won't give you leverage over the estate. But it will exist, because he deserves to exist in it, regardless of everything. The silence that followed was very full. Then Vanessa said in a voice that was barely holding together, Why? Because he didn't do anything wrong, I said, and because Lucas would have wanted him to have something. Even if Lucas didn't know he was coming, even if none of us knew. I stopped. My boys are gone, but they left things behind. Lucas left Noah. Ethan left Neurobridge. I'm going to take care of both. Vanessa pressed one hand flat against her mouth. The tears were running now, and she wasn't performing them. They were the real kind, the kind that come when someone does something unexpected and generous and your body doesn't know what to do with it. Or maybe they were shame. Maybe they were both. Probably they were both, mixed together in the way that real feelings mix, when the situation is genuinely complicated. I don't deserve that, she said. Probably not, I said, but Noah does. She looked at me across the table through her wet eyes, and I looked back at her, and for a moment, just a moment, she looked like what she actually was, a woman in her 30s who had made a catastrophic choice out of a combination of grief and fear and self-interest, and had been living inside the consequences of it for over a year, and had not been caught until she'd chosen, finally, to catch herself. She was not a villain. I had been working toward that conclusion for weeks, and I had finally arrived at it, reluctantly, the way you arrive at conclusions that complicate your anger. She was not a hero. She was something more difficult than either, a person who had done something genuinely wrong, and also been genuinely afraid. And those two things were both true at the same time and didn't cancel each other out. There are conditions, I said. She nodded quickly. Tell me. The social accounts, and I said, the grief platform, the media presence, that ends. She went very still. I am not going to allow Noah's identity, his paternity, his connection to Lucas, any of this, to become content, I said, and the word content came out with more edge than I intended, but I let it stand. He will not grow up as a character in a story you're telling for strangers online. When he's old enough to make choices about his own story, he can make them. Until then, his life is private. She stopped. Started again. That's a significant ask. Yes, I said, it is. Those accounts are how I've maintained, how I've kept connection to people who... Vanessa. I leaned forward slightly. I'm aware of what those accounts are. I'm aware of what they're for. And I am telling you that if controlling Noah's narrative online is more important to you than the arrangement I'm offering, you should call a lawyer this afternoon. She looked at me for a long moment, then she looked down. Okay, she said. Okay. There's one more thing, I said. Her eyes came back up. Noah will know who Lucas was, I said. When he's old enough to understand, when the time is right, we will tell him the truth about his father. I will not allow him to grow up believing he's Ethan's son when he's Lucas's. That's a lie I won't carry, and I won't allow you to carry it either. Something moved across her face. Not resistance exactly, but the weight of a door being closed on the version of the story she might have preferred. The easier version, the cleaner one. I know, she said. I've thought about that. I know that has to happen. Good, I said. Then we understand each other. I picked up my coffee and I drank some of it, and the ordinariness of that gesture. Just a woman drinking coffee in the middle of an extraordinary conversation seemed to settle something in the air between us. Not resolution, not yet, but the beginning of a framework, the first thin scaffolding of something that might, eventually, become a way to live. We sat there for another 20 minutes, talking through the practical things, the timeline for Edward to formalize the fund structure, the question of the house and how the marital property questions would be handled without litigation, small things, large things, the administrative architecture of a situation that had no clean precedent and would require constant navigation. It was not a good conversation in the way that good conversations are good. It was a necessary one. There is a difference, and I've stopped pretending there isn't. When we stood to leave, Vanessa put on her coat and looked at me across the table with the same expression she'd worn at the door of my kitchen 10 days before, that unmameable thing, gratitude and shame and something that wanted to be more than both. Margaret, she said. I know, I said. Don't. She nodded. She left. I sat back down. I ordered a second coffee I hadn't planned on, and I sat at that table in Coldwell's on Marsh Street, and I breathed slowly in and out, while the coffee shop moved around me in its ordinary way. I thought I was done. I thought the worst of it was behind me. I thought the conversation had been the climax, the confrontation, the truth laid bare, the terms established, and that what remained was just the long, quiet work of implementation. I was wrong. I didn't know it yet, but the thing I had been waiting for, the thing I had not anticipated, the piece of all of this that would hit harder than any of the rest, was still coming. It was coming from a direction I hadn't thought to watch. It was coming from inside the company Ethan had built. Edward called me on a Thursday morning, 12 days after the Caldwell's meeting, and his voice had the particular register of a man who is being very careful not to alarm someone he is in fact alarmed. Margaret, he said, I need you to come in today, not next week, today. Ed, what happened? A pause. There's been a filing in Ethan's name. I sat down very slowly. Ethan is dead. I know, he said. The filing predates his death by 8 months. It was held back. Someone held it back and released it now, and I need you to see it in person before we talk about what it means. I was in his office by noon. The document was 11 pages. It was a codicil, an amendment to a will, post-dating the trust structure Ethan had set up, signed with Ethan's signature, but dated 3 months before he changed the trust. And what it said, what it appeared to say in the careful language of estate law, was that in the event of Ethan's death, a 15% stake in Neurobridge should be transferred to a holding company named Halcyon Bridge LLC. I had never heard of Halcyon Bridge LLC. Who does it belong to? I asked. Edward looked at me steadily. We're still working on that, he said. The ownership structure is layered, but the registered agent is a firm out of Delaware, and the first name in the chain is... He stopped. Margaret. The first name in the chain is Vanessa Hale. The room did something strange. Went very quiet and very still, the way rooms do in the moment before something breaks. She filed it 12 days ago, I said, not a question. The timing is... She filed it 12 days ago, I said again. 2 days after our conversation at Caldwell's. Edward said nothing. I looked at the document. I looked at Ethan's signature, which I had seen 10,000 times on birthday cards and checks, and the letters he sent me in his 20s before texting made letters obsolete. I knew his signature the way I knew his voice. Not perfectly, but in the bones. Something about this one was wrong. I couldn't have said exactly what. The shape of the E maybe, the angle of the last loop, the pressure of it somehow communicated through photocopied paper in a way that made the hair on my arm stand up. Ed, I said, how many people knew about Ethan's trust structure, the specific provisions? It was kept very close, he said. Myself, the firm's senior partner, and Ethan, and you. Could Vanessa have known the details? She knew there was a trust. She knew you were trustee. The specifics, he paused. She would have needed access to documents she wasn't provided. Or a different source, I said. Yes. Or someone inside the firm. A longer pause. I have to ask you something, I said, and I need you to answer me directly. Of course. Is that Ethan's signature? Edward looked at the document. He had been looking at it for 3 hours before I arrived. He looked at it again now, and I watched his face, and what I saw there told me everything before he said a word. I don't know, he said. I genuinely don't know, which is why I've already called a forensic document examiner. I put the document down on his desk. I pressed my hands flat on the glass surface, and I breathed. 12 days ago, I had sat across from Vanessa Hale in a coffee shop and told her that I was not going to make her life impossible, that I would create a fund for Noah, that I was prepared not to forgive, not entirely, but to function, to move forward, to treat the situation with something resembling humanity, and she had left that coffee shop, and she had driven to wherever her lawyer was, and she had filed this document, holding all the cards now, Claire Sato's words. Said around the time Noah was born, before Vanessa knew I knew, when she thought the game was already won. Maybe she still thought that. Maybe she had left Caldwell's and read my generosity as weakness, read my willingness to set up a fund for Noah as an indicator of how far I could be pushed, decided that if I would give an inch, I would give a mile, that the right move was to take the conversation we'd had and use it as cover while she executed a different plan entirely. If that was what she'd done, if that document was what I thought it was, then the Vanessa I'd looked at across the table, the one with the wet eyes and the shaking voice and the I don't deserve that, had not been showing me something real. She had been buying time. I stood up from Edward's desk. I want to know, I said, within 48 hours whether that signature is forged. We'll have preliminary findings by tomorrow afternoon, he said. Good. I picked up my bag. I straightened my coat. I did something I had been doing my whole life, the thing that my sons had teased me about, the thing that my neighbors read as steadiness. I composed myself. And Ed, I said at the door, yes? Tell the document examiner to take their time and do it right, I said. I only need to do this once. I walked out of his office and into the elevator and stood very still while the floors descended, and when the doors opened in the lobby, I walked through them into the afternoon air, and I stood on the sidewalk and I thought, you should not have done that, not to Ethan's company, not to his memory, not to me. I had offered her a way forward. I had offered it knowing full well what she'd done, at personal cost, in the face of every reason I had to simply close the door. And she had looked me in the eyes and taken the offer and filed a forged document 2 days later. The clarity I'd found in those 10 days of silence, the cold, useful clarity that was better than anger, sharpened into something new, something with an edge to it. I was done being gentle. I had been generous because I believed she was capable of something better. If she wasn't, if this was the answer to my generosity, then I was going to finish this the way Ethan would have finished it, methodically, completely, without flinching. I got in my car. I had calls to make. The forensic document examiner's name was Dr. Patricia Weil, and she had been doing this work for 27 years. Edward had used her twice before, once in a probate dispute, once in a corporate fraud case, and he said She was the kind of expert who understood that her job was not to tell you what you wanted to hear, but to tell you what the document said. I appreciated that. I had stopped wanting people to manage me somewhere around month 3 of all this, and the last thing I needed now was someone softening edges. She called Edward at 4:17 on Friday afternoon. He called me at 4:19. "It's forged, he said, no preamble. Patricia is 94% confident. The signature shows evidence of tracing, micro hesitations in the stroke pattern that aren't consistent with Ethan's natural writing speed. The ink also dates incorrectly for the purported signing date, though that finding is secondary." I was standing in my kitchen. I had been standing in my kitchen for most of the past 24 hours, it felt like, as if some part of me understood that this was where the important things happened and had decided to simply stay there and wait. 94%, I said. "In forensic document examination, that's as close to certain as the field gets," Edward said. "Patricia will testify to it." "Who filed it?" I said. "Mechanically, and who walked it into the court office and filed it?" "An attorney," he said, "a solo practitioner named Gordon Fess. We're looking at him now. He's not a sophisticated operator. He does minor estate work, some real estate closings. He's not the kind of firm you'd expect to be involved in something like this, meaning he was hired to do one task and probably didn't ask questions," I said. "That would be my read." I put my hand flat on the counter. The kitchen window was dark outside. I hadn't noticed the evening coming, and my reflection looked back at me from the glass. A 61-year-old woman with her hand on a counter, learning that her daughter-in-law had tried to forge her dead son's name. "Ed," I said, "I want to be very clear about what I'm asking for next, so there's no ambiguity, of course. I want this documented completely, every piece of it, the forensic findings, the filing records, the chain of the Halcyon Bridge LLC. Whoever is at the end of that chain, I want all of it bulletproof before we take any action. We're already building that, he said. But Margaret, this isn't just a trust dispute anymore. Document forgery in a probate proceeding is a criminal matter." "I know," I said, a pause. "You're not going to call her first." It wasn't a question. He knew the answer already, I think. He had known it since I walked out of his office the day before. "No," I said, "I'm not." I had offered her a table. I had sat across from her, and I had been more generous than anyone who knew the full story would have expected me to be, and she had left that table and filed a forged document. The time for private conversations was over. Whatever came next was going to be formal, documented, and final. I was done being the quiet woman in the kitchen. What followed was 3 weeks of work that I was not directly part of, but was entirely aware of. The kind of work that happens in law offices and forensic labs and corporate records departments, the unglamorous machinery of building a case. Edward kept me informed with daily calls that were precise and brief, which was exactly what I needed. Halcyon Bridge LLC, it turned out, had been incorporated 14 months ago, 2 months after Ethan's diagnosis became serious. Its sole owner, beneath 2 layers of holding companies, was Vanessa Hale. The attorney who had filed the codicil, Gordon Fess, had been paid through a personal check drawn on an account in Vanessa's name. He had been told, according to his later statement, that the document was a legitimate estate filing that needed to be introduced at a specific time for tax purposes, and that his client, whom he knew as a woman named Anne Marsh, which was not a name I recognized, but which investigators confirmed was linked to an email account Vanessa had maintained under a variation of her mother's maiden name, had assured him everything was in order. He was, as Edward had predicted, not sophisticated. He had not asked the questions he should have asked. He was also not the kind of person who, when confronted with what he had actually been part of, would choose to protect his client over his own bar license. He talked to investigators on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the picture was complete. Edward laid it out for me at his conference table, with his senior partner present and a second attorney who specialized in criminal referrals, and the three of them walked me through it with the careful professionalism of people who understood that what they were about to recommend was significant and irreversible. "You have several options," Edward said. "First, you can pursue this through the civil courts. Challenge the codicil, have it voided, and limit the consequences to Vanessa to the estate context. She loses any claim she was attempting to make, the LLC is dissolved, and the matter ends there." "What's the second option?" I said. "Criminal referral," said the third attorney, whose name was James Okafor, and who had a quiet directness I appreciated. "We refer the forgery evidence to the district attorney's office. At that point, it's out of our hands. The state decides whether to prosecute." "And if they prosecute," I said, "what does that look like for Vanessa?" James folded his hands. "Document forgery in a probate proceeding carries significant exposure, depending on what the DA finds when they pull the full financial picture, and they will pull it. She could be looking at multiple felony counts. Fraud, forgery, potentially wire fraud, if any of the communications crossed state lines electronically." He paused. "She would very likely go to prison." The conference room was very quiet. "And Noah?" I said. Nobody answered immediately, which was itself an answer. A mother in prison, a child without a primary parent. Whatever arrangement would need to be made, foster care or family placement or some other structure I hadn't let myself fully think through, it would fall to the courts and to whoever stepped forward, which, given that I was the only family that child had left in any meaningful sense, meant it would fall to me. I sat with that. I sat with the version of justice that put Vanessa in a courtroom and then a cell. And I tried to find the place in me where that felt like the right answer, and I couldn't get there. Not entirely. Not when Noah was 14 months old and would not remember any of this, and would grow up knowing only that the choices made before he could speak had determined the shape of everything. That was not Noah's fault. It would never be Noah's fault. "How much time do I have to decide?" I asked. "The evidence will keep," Edward said, "but I'd want a decision within the next 2 weeks. After that, the longer we hold this, the more it starts to look like strategic delay, which we don't want." 2 weeks, I said. "All right." I drove home in the kind of focus that lives just past exhaustion, where everything is very sharp and very clear because there is no energy left for it to be anything else. I made dinner I actually ate, which felt like a small victory. I called my friend Dorothy, who is the oldest friend I have and who knew both my boys since they were in grade school, and I talked to her about something entirely unrelated for 40 minutes because I needed to hear a voice that existed outside of all of this. Then I sat at my kitchen table with a blank piece of paper, and I wrote at the top, "What does Ethan want me to do?" And underneath it, after a long time, "What does Lucas want me to do?" And underneath that, after longer, "What does Noah need?" I looked at those 3 questions for a while. Then I turned the paper over and I wrote the answer that had been forming, slowly, without my full permission for the past 2 weeks. Not the answer that was easiest, not the one that was most satisfying in the hot, immediate sense of the word, the one that was right. I called Vanessa myself, not through Edward, not through any intermediary. I called her on a Sunday morning early when the light was still grey and quiet. She answered on the 3rd ring, and her voice had the careful alertness of someone who had also been waiting, though for what exactly she couldn't have known. "I need you to come to my house," I said. "Today." A silence. Then, "Is this about—" "I'm not going to discuss it on the phone," I said. "Come at 2 o'clock. She came at 2 o'clock. She was dressed like someone who had thought carefully about what to wear and then changed 3 times. I recognized the result. The slightly overdone casualness of a person trying to appear uncalculating. She had Noah with her, in a carrier on her chest, which I noticed and filed. She had brought the baby. Whether that was instinct or strategy, I decided not to determine, because it didn't matter. Noah was here. He was awake, blinking at the world with the mild astonishment of a 40-month-old who finds everything equally surprising and equally acceptable. He had a smear of something orange on his chin, sweet potato probably, and he looked at me from his carrier and made a sound that was not quite a word yet, but was gesturing in the direction of one. "Come in," I said. We went to the kitchen. Of course we went to the kitchen. Vanessa sat at the table with Noah in her lap, and I sat across from her. And I put a single folder on the table between us. I did not open it. "I want to tell you what's in there," I said, "and then I want to tell you what I've decided. And I need you to understand that what I'm offering you right now is the last offer. There will not be another one." Her eyes went to the folder, back to me. "Okay," she said. Her voice was carefully neutral, but her hands on Noah's back were not. "Halcyon Bridge LLC," I said. Her face did something complicated. The neutrality cracked along a very specific fault line. Not surprise, I noted, but something closer to resignation, as if she had known this was coming, and had simply been waiting to find out when. "Gordon Fess," I said. "Anna Marsh. The incorporation date, the payment records, Patricia Vile's forensic findings on the signature." I kept my voice flat and even. "I have all of it, Vanessa, every piece, documented and verified." She looked at Noah's head. She pressed her lips together. "Look at me," I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were dry, which surprised me. I had expected tears, the real kind or the managed kind, either one. But there were none. Just a woman looking at the end of a road she had built herself and walked down herself and arrived at herself. "I'm going to ask you one question," I said, Hamasado, "and I need you to answer me truthfully, because the answer is going to affect what I do next." She nodded. "The codicil," I said. "Whose idea was it?" A long pause. "Mine," she said. "Entirely mine. Gordon didn't know what he was filing. He thought it was legitimate." "I know that, Mas," I said. "I'm asking who conceived it, who planned it." "I did," she said. "No one helped me. Not a lawyer, not someone advising you." "I found the information I needed online," she said, which was a sentence that contained multitudes of the modern world's particular dangers. "I made the decisions. I executed them. There was no one else." I believed her. Not because she was incapable of lying, she had demonstrated otherwise at considerable length, but because the plan had the specific quality of something designed by a person who was smart and desperate and did not have anyone sophisticated enough to tell them it was a catastrophically bad idea. "All right," I said. "Margaret." Her voice broke on my name, finally. Not performed. The real break, the one that comes from the body and not the strategy. "I know what I did. I know I can't explain it in a way that makes it acceptable. She stopped. Her hand tightened on Noah's back. I was looking at everything disappearing, the trust, the estate, any future I thought I'd secured, and I panicked, and I did something I cannot undo. "No," I said. "You can't. Are you going to the police?" The question sat between us. Noah turned his head and looked at me from his mother's lap, and his coal grey eyes, Lucas's eyes, the family eyes, the ones that had looked at me from my sons' faces for 38 and 31 years respectively, met mine with the absolute, uncomplicated directness of a very small person who has no idea what the adults around him are deciding. "I have grounds to refer this to the district attorney," I said. "Document forgery in a probate proceeding is a felony. James Okafor, who is a very good attorney, has told me that prosecution would likely result in conviction." I held her eyes. "You would go to prison, probably for between 2 and 4 years, depending on what else they found when they dug." Vanessa's face had gone very still. Not the performance stillness, the real kind, the kind that is shock so deep it bypasses the body entirely. "But I'm not going to do that," I said. She blinked. "I am not going to do that," I said again. Because Noah is 14 months old and he did not forge a signature, and he does not deserve to lose his mother on top of everything else that has already been decided for him without his consent. I let that sit for a moment. However, what is going to happen instead is this. I opened the folder. I turned it toward her. It was a document, not the forgery that was in Edward's office in a fireproof cabinet. This was something Edward and I had drafted together over 2 days, with James Okafor reviewing every line. This is a comprehensive relinquishment, so I said, you are going to sign it. It formally withdraws the fraudulent codicil, dissolves Halcyon Bridge LLC, and relinquishes any claim you make, now or in the future, to the Neurobridge Trust or any assets covered under it. In exchange, I will not pursue criminal charges. I will not pursue civil fraud claims. The marital property questions, the house, the marital account, those proceed according to standard law, which means you are provided for. Not lavishly, but provided for. She was reading the document. Her eyes moved down the page slowly. The fund for Noah stands, I said. That was never conditional on your behavior. It's for him, not you, and it will exist regardless of what you sign. She looked up. There's a clause at the bottom of page 3, I said, about the social accounts. That condition remains. Noah's life is private until he is old enough to make his own choices about it. She found page 3, read it, nodded once, almost to herself. And the last clause, I said, page 4. She turned the page. I watched her read it. I watched her reach the paragraph that I had drafted myself. Not Edward, not James, myself, in my own kitchen, in my own handwriting first and then typed. And I watched her face change. The clause said this, in legal language that I will translate for you, that Vanessa would agree to full and transparent cooperation in eventually telling Noah the truth of his paternity, that she would not construct an alternate narrative for him, that when the time was determined by me in consultation with a family therapist of my choosing, she would participate in that conversation with honesty and without obstruction, that she would not take Noah out of the state without my prior knowledge, that she would support his relationship with the Cole family, meaning me, meaning whatever of my family remained in the world. It was, in practical terms, a custody framework without being labeled one. It was a set of guardrails, the kind of guardrails you put in place, not because you expect them to be tested every day, but because you know from hard, specific, documented experience that without them, the road has no edges. You're asking me to let you be in his life, she said. I'm requiring it, I said. If you want the arrangement I'm offering. She looked at me for a long moment, not calculating. I would have seen that by now. I'd gotten very good at seeing that. This was something else, something more tired than calculation and more real. I want him to know you, Aunt, she said. I've always wanted that, whatever you think of me. I believe you when I said, partly, she repeated. You're not a simple person, Vanessa, I said. I stopped expecting simple answers from you a long time ago, but I believe that somewhere in all of what you've done, there is a piece of you that genuinely loves that child and wants him to have a real family. I believe that piece exists. I paused. I'm building this arrangement around that piece, not around the rest of you. Something moved across her face that I couldn't fully name. It was too layered, too mixed, the way all real feelings are when the situation has been going on long enough for the simple versions to burn away. If I sign this, she said, and then you decide later to pursue charges anyway, the relinquishment is a binding contract in both directions, as I said. I'm trading legal action for your cooperation. If you cooperate, I will hold to my side completely. If you don't, I held her eyes, then the evidence goes to James Okafor, and he makes the call. You're trusting me, she said, and there was something in her voice that was almost, not quite, but almost, disbelieving. I'm trusting the structure, I said. There's a difference. She looked at the document again. She looked at Noah, who had gotten bored with the adult stillness and was investigating the edge of the table with both hands, and the focused concentration of someone encountering a fascinating engineering problem. "Can I take this to a lawyer before I sign?" she said. "Yes," I said. "You have 72 hours. She looked up, surprised by the reasonableness of it. "Vanessa," I said, "I'm not trying to trap you. I'm trying to end this. There's a difference between those things too." She nodded slowly. She picked up Noah, who made a sound of mild protest at being interrupted from the table investigation, and she settled him on her hip and stood up. She took the folder. She held it against her chest with one arm and Noah against her side with the other, and she stood in my kitchen in the late afternoon light, and she looked, I thought, like a woman who was very tired and very aware of exactly how she had gotten here. "I'll call you, Al," she said. "I know you will, I said. She left. I listened to her car back out of the driveway. I listened to it move down the street and disappear into the neighborhood sounds. Then I did something I had not done in a very long time. I went to the spare room, where the albums were still stacked against the wall from where I'd left them 3 weeks ago. I sat on the floor and I opened the album to a photograph of Ethan and Lucas together. Christmas, years ago, both of them in terrible sweaters that I had given them as a joke and they had worn in spite of it. They were laughing at something outside the frame. Ethan's hand was on Lucas's shoulder. Lucas was mid-sentence, probably saying something that would have made me tell him to watch his language. I looked at that photograph for a long time. "I'm doing the best I can," I said to it, out loud. To an empty room, to a photograph, to the particular kind of silence that used to be filled with my son's voices. The album said nothing back, but it didn't need to. I already knew what they would have said. Not perfectly. I could not reconstruct them perfectly, no mother can. Grief simplifies people in ways that the living resist and the dead can't argue against. But I knew the broad shape of it. Ethan would have wanted the company protected, and he would have been satisfied by the structure I'd built. Lucas would have wanted his son provided for, and he would have felt something complicated and layered about Vanessa that I had long since stopped trying to resolve on his behalf. And both of them, both of my boys, the builder and the laugher, the quiet one and the loud one, would have wanted me to keep standing. So that was what I intended to do. Vanessa's attorney called Edward. 61 hours later. There were 3 requested modifications to the relinquishment document. 2 were minor. Language clarifications that James Okafor and her attorney resolved in a 40-minute call. The 3rd was more substantive. She wanted the clause about out-of-state travel modified to require notification rather than prior approval, which was a reasonable distinction and one that James said we could accept without compromising the intent. We accepted it. The document was signed on a Thursday morning, not in my kitchen, in Edward's conference room, which was the right place for it. Formal, witnessed, notarized, unambiguous. Vanessa arrived with her attorney, a woman named Patricia Cho, who was considerably more sophisticated than Gordon Fess, and who had clearly advised Vanessa thoroughly. Because Vanessa was composed and prepared in a way that told me she had been walked through every line and had made her peace with what she was agreeing to. I was there, Edward was there, James was there. 2 witnesses the firm provided. Vanessa sat across the conference table and she read through the final version one more time, which is what you do when you're about to sign something that changes the shape of your life, even if you've already read it 100 times. Then she picked up the pen. She paused just for a moment before she put it to paper. She looked up at me. I did not look away. She signed. The notary did what notaries do. The witnesses signed. Edward collected the pages. It was, from a procedural standpoint, entirely ordinary, the mechanical conclusion of something that had been anything but. Afterward, in the hallway, while our attorney spoke briefly about the practical next steps, Vanessa stood next to me waiting for the elevator, and neither of us said anything for a moment. The hallway smelled like carpet and recirculated air, and the particular nothing smell of office buildings everywhere. "What happens now?" she said. "Not to the situation, to me specifically. Now we figure out how to be in that child's life without destroying each other." I said. "Do you think we can?" I thought about that honestly. I don't know, I said. I've never done anything like this before. Neither have I, she said. I know, I said. That's actually part of the problem. The elevator arrived. We rode down together in silence. In the lobby, we went in different directions. She toward the parking structure, me toward the street. I got half a dozen steps before I heard her say my name. I turned. She was standing in the middle of the lobby, holding her bag, looking at me with an expression that I had come to understand. Slowly, reluctantly, at considerable personal cost, was as close to honest as she was capable of getting. For what it's worth, she said, I know what you gave up, pressing charges, the satisfaction of it. I know you had every right. Yes, I said, I did. Why didn't you? I looked at her. I thought about Noah's grey eyes on the kitchen table, the coal grey, Lucas's grey. I thought about Ethan making me promise. I thought about Lucas throwing a football against the side of a house on a summer afternoon 30 years ago. Because I'm their mother, so, I said, and that's not a thing that stops. I walked out into the afternoon. The street was busy, full of people going about the ordinary business of their lives, and I walked among them, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, something that was not grief or anger or fear or exhaustion, something quieter than all of those things, something that did not have a name yet but was moving in the direction of one. I had a call to make, not to Edward, not to Ray, not to anyone connected to the machinery of the past year. I was going to call Dorothy and tell her I needed dinner and company, and to talk about something else entirely, and then I was going to go home and sleep properly for the first time in months. But first I stopped on the sidewalk, right there in the middle of the afternoon foot traffic, and I breathed. In, out, still standing, still here. It was enough. For today, it was enough. The sleep I promised myself that Thursday night was the best I had gotten in 14 months. I want to say that lightly, because it is not a small thing. 14 months of 4 a.m. waking, of lying in the dark running numbers and timelines and conversations, of dreaming about Ethan's hands or Lucas's laugh, and waking up to the particular cruelty of remembering fresh every single morning that they were gone. 14 months of a body that had forgotten how to rest, because rest requires a kind of surrender that grief does not allow. That Thursday night I slept 7 hours straight. I woke at 6:15 to the sound of birds, which is the most ordinary sound in the world, and I lay there for a few minutes just listening to them, and I thought it is possible to come through something, not past it, not over it, through it. The way you walk through weather, you are wet and cold and it is genuinely terrible, and then at some point you are on the other side and the weather is still happening, but you are no longer in the worst of it. That was where I was. Still in the weather, but through the worst of it. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the yard in the early morning light, the oak tree that had been there since before I moved into this house, the garden bed that had been neglected all year and showed it. I had a lot of catching up to do, in the garden and everywhere else. I had spent so long being the woman who was protecting something that I had forgotten to also be the woman who was living somewhere. It was time to remember. The Noah Fund, as Edward and I had taken to calling it in shorthand, was formally established 6 weeks after the signing. The legal name was the Lucas Cole Educational and Welfare Trust. I had chosen Lucas's name deliberately, and when Edward asked if I was certain, I said yes without hesitating, because Noah deserved to know from the beginning which of my sons had given him life, and this was the first small way I could make that true. The fund was structured to cover education from primary school through university, medical costs not covered by standard insurance, and what the documents called foundational welfare expenses, which in practice meant that Noah would not grow up poor. He would not grow up rich in the way that Ethan's estate could have made him rich. He would grow up provided for, which is a different thing, and I have come to believe a healthier one. There is something that obscene wealth does to children who inherit it before they have done anything to understand it, and I had watched enough of Ethan's world to know that it was not always a kindness. What Noah would have was enough to go to whatever school he could earn his way into, enough to see a doctor without fear, enough to start his adult life without the particular handicap of having nothing to start with. After that, what he made of himself would be his own. I thought Lucas would have approved of that. I thought Ethan would have too. The Neurobridge Trust remained under my authority, which in practice meant I worked closely with the company's existing board, the people Ethan had hired, the ones who had actually built the thing alongside him, to ensure that his vision continued to be honored. I am not a technology person. I want to be clear about that. I understood approximately 15% of what was discussed in my first board meeting, and I sat through it with the same still face I had brought to every difficult room in the past year and a half. And I asked the questions I could ask, and I deferred on the questions I couldn't. And afterward, Ethan's chief operating officer, a careful woman named Sandra Lim, found me in the hallway and said, "You're doing fine, you know. He talked about you." See, I stopped. "What did he say?" Sandra considered. "He said you were the steadiest person he'd ever known. He said that if anything happened to him, the company would be safe with you because you would find the right people to listen to and you would not be moved by the wrong things." She paused. He was right. I thanked her. I went to my car. I sat in it for a few minutes. The steadiest person he'd ever known. I thought about all the times in the past year I had sat on floors. I thought about the cold water on my wrist. I thought about the 4 a.m. mornings and the soup I hadn't eaten and the album spread around me in the spare room. Steady doesn't mean untouched, I thought. It means you don't stop moving. I started the car and I drove home. And I thought that if Ethan had known that, if he'd understood the difference between unshakable and simply persistent, then maybe I had taught him something after all. That thought kept me warm for a long time. The first time I saw Noah after everything was finalized was a Saturday in September, 14 days after the signing. Vanessa brought him to my house, which was the arrangement we had loosely agreed to, that she would bring him every other Saturday for a few hours, and that I would come to her on the alternating weeks, and that we would adjust as things developed. And as Noah got old enough to have opinions about it, he was 16 months old by then, walking in the particular manner of very new walkers, forward momentum without much steering, a kind of committed lurch that took him from one piece of furniture to the next, with his arms slightly raised, like a man on a boat deck. He had more hair than when I'd last seen him. He was wearing a red shirt with a small dog on it. He walked into my kitchen and stopped and looked around at the new space with the serious concentration of someone conducting an assessment. Then he looked at me. "Hi," I said, the way you say hi to a small person, soft and at his level. He considered me for a moment. Then he took 4 lurching steps toward me and put one hand flat on my knee, which was not an embrace and was not really a greeting, but was something. Contact, acknowledgement, the small animal fact of, "I see you and I am not afraid." I put my hand over his. It was the size of a bird's nest. His fingers were warm. I did not cry, because I had made a private decision some weeks before that I was not going to spend the rest of my relationship with this child crying in front of him, and I intended to honor that. But it was a near thing. It was a genuinely near thing. "He likes kitchen," Vanessa said from the doorway in a voice that was carefully casual, in the way of a person who is also trying not to cry. "He always goes straight for the kitchen in any new place." "He's a coal," I said, which was not nothing. Vanessa looked at me with the expression I was slowly learning to read, the one that contained things she was not ready to say, and might never be ready to say, but was not pretending weren't there. Progress of a kind. "I'll be in the living room, please," she said. "Take your time." She gave us the kitchen, which was more than I had expected from her, and less than she owed, and exactly what was needed in that moment. which is the kind of complicated arithmetic that had come to define everything between us. I sat on the floor. There I was again, sitting on the floor. Apparently this was simply who I was now. And Noah and I spent 40 minutes together in the way that adults and very small children spend time. He investigated things and I watched him, and occasionally he brought me something to assess, and I assessed it with appropriate gravity, and he took it back satisfied. He found a wooden spoon I had left on the low shelf and carried it around for 10 minutes like a very important document. He knocked it against the cabinet door repeatedly, listening to the sound it made, absorbed in the pure sensory pleasure of cause and effect. I watched him and I thought, Lucas did that. Lucas had been exactly that kind of child, physical, curious, delighted by the sounds things made and the way things worked, fully in his body in a way that Ethan never quite was. There it was already, in the lurch of his walking and the absolute focus of his attention. The genetics of a man who had been dead for 4 years, alive and lurching around my kitchen with a wooden spoon. It was the strangest and most extraordinary thing I had ever sat with. Not happy exactly, not sad, something between and beyond both. Something that doesn't have a clean name in English. That feeling of an enormous complexity that you cannot resolve but have decided to carry. When Vanessa came to collect him, he protested being taken from the spoon investigation with an indignant sound that was entirely Lucas, and she laughed, a real laugh. The first one I'd heard from her that didn't have anything managed underneath it, and said, he hates leaving things unfinished. So did his father, I said. She met my eyes. We both understood which father I meant. I know, she said softly. We were not friends. I want to be clear about that because this story doesn't need a tidy ending where two women who have hurt each other discover unexpected kinship and move forward in mutual warmth. That is not what happened. What happened was more ordinary and more sustainable. Two people who were bound together by a child decided, separately and then together, that the binding was going to be something they maintained with professionalism and occasional honesty, and the firm understanding that neither of them was going to pretend the past hadn't happened. That was enough. It was genuinely enough. Some relationships are repaired. Some are rebuilt into something different from what they were. And some are simply managed, carefully, deliberately, with clear eyes and clear agreements, and managed well, and the managing itself becomes a kind of peace. That was what Vanessa and I were doing. I did not love her. I no longer hated her, which had been a more difficult transition than I expected. I had come to understand her, not to excuse her, not to romanticize the desperation that had driven her, but to understand that she was a person who had been shaped by grief and fear into someone capable of things she might not otherwise have been capable of, and that understanding was not the same as forgiveness, but it was adjacent to it, and I was willing to live in the adjacency. That was the most I could offer. She seemed to know it. She had not asked for more. 3 months after the signing, I did something I had been delaying for reasons I couldn't entirely articulate. I went to visit Lucas's grave. I went alone on a weekday morning in November when the cemetery was mostly empty and the light was flat and grey and honest. Lucas was buried in the same cemetery where we had buried my mother and father, which had been his choice. He had said years before he died that he wanted to be near the grandparents he'd actually known. That was the kind of thing Lucas said, practical and sentimental at the same time in the way he did everything. His headstone was simple. I had chosen it because there was no one else to choose it, and I had chosen what I would have wanted. His name, his dates, and underneath, in the plain Roman letters I'd requested, the word brother, not son, not beloved, brother, because that was the word he would have chosen for himself. I stood at the grave for a while. The grass had grown properly now. It had taken 2 years to look right, to look like the earth had accepted him, which is a thing I have noticed about graves and tried not to think about too hard. You have a son, Ates, I told him. The cemetery did what cemeteries do. It stayed quiet and let me say what I came to say. His name is Noah. He walks like you. He has your ears. He carried a wooden spoon around my kitchen for 10 minutes, like it was the most important thing in the world. And watching him do it, I could see you so clearly. I stopped, breathed. It hurt and it helped at the same time. I don't know another way to describe it. A bird moved somewhere in the trees behind me. I don't know what you felt for Vanessa, I said. I don't know if it was the real thing or something on the way to the real thing. I don't know if she loved you the way you deserve to be loved. I hope she did. I choose to believe she did, because you were my boy and you deserved that. And I'd rather carry that belief than the other one. I put my hand on the top of the headstone, the way I had when we buried him, the way I had done every time I visited. The stone was cold in November, cold and solid, and exactly what it was. I'm taking care of him, I said. I promised Ethan I'd protect what he built, and I promised myself I'd honor what you left behind, and I'm going to do both for as long as I'm standing. I paused, which at this rate may be quite a while. I appear to be more difficult to break than I thought. That was the closest I came to humor there at the graveside. I don't know if it counted. I think Lucas would have counted it. I drove home with the particular clarity that comes after saying things out loud that have been living only in your chest. The roads were ordinary. The world was ordinary. I had a meeting with Edward the next morning about the quarterly trust review, and dinner with Dorothy on Friday. And on Saturday, Noah was coming to my kitchen again with his lurch and his focused attention and his father's ears. The calendar was filling up in the way that calendars fill up when a person is living rather than merely surviving. That was new. That was good. That was, I was learning, what the other side of the weather felt like. I want to tell you what I know now that I didn't know when this started. I know that protecting something is not the same as holding on to it for months, nearly a year. I confused those two things. I thought protecting Ethan's legacy meant keeping it exactly as he'd left it, sealed and defended and unchanged, mine to guard like something in a glass case. But that's not what he asked me to do. He asked me to protect it. And protection, real protection, means understanding what a thing is for and making sure it can keep being that thing in a world that keeps moving. Neurobridge is still running. Sandra Lim is a remarkable operator. And the board Ethan assembled is good. They don't need me to understand the technology. They need me to be the person who will not let the company be turned into something Ethan wouldn't recognize. And I can do that. I have done that. I will keep doing it. I know that anger is not the same as strength. In the beginning, when the shape of what Vanessa had done was first becoming clear, I mistook the coldness of my resolve for strength, and the heat of the underlying fury for weakness that needed to be suppressed. But they're the same thing. They're both just love, redirected. The cold part and the hot part both came from the same source. I loved my sons, and they were gone, and someone had used their absence in ways that were unconscionable. And both the fury and the resolve were just grief looking for a direction. What I learned, slowly and at significant cost, was to let them work together, instead of suppressing one in favor of the other. The anger told me what mattered. The resolve told me what to do about it. I know that forgiveness is not a door you walk through once. It is more like a practice, something you have to choose again and again, on the days when you don't want to and on the days when you've almost forgotten you need to. I have not forgiven Vanessa. I am in the process of it. Some days that process goes forward, and some days something happens. A memory surfaces, or I look at Noah's face and think about what it cost to bring him into the world. Or I catch a moment where Vanessa's old calculation creeps back into her eyes, and the process pauses, and I have to start it again from wherever I am. That is the truth of it. Anyone who tells you different is selling a simpler story than the one life actually tells. I know that legacy is not what you accumulate. I had thought, somewhere in the back of my mind, in the years when both my boys were alive and building their lives, that legacy was the thing you left behind. The money, the company, the children, the accomplishments, the record. But what I understand now, standing on the far side of a year that tried repeatedly to break me, is that legacy is what happens when your values outlive your presence. It is not the things you leave. It is the shape of the choices that remain after you are gone, and whether those choices still look like you. Ethan left near a bridge and a trust and a set of instructions that said, protect this. But what he really left was his belief that the right structures, built carefully and held firmly by the right person, could outlast anything. That was his mind at work, even at the end. Even from a hospital bed, still building, Lucas left a son he never knew he was leaving. And what that son carries, in his ears and his walk and his stubborn focus on the things that interest him, is something that no document and no court order and no amount of deliberate planning could have produced. It just is. It just arrived. It is the most purely accidental legacy I have ever witnessed, and somehow, improbably, it is also the one that gives me the most comfort, because Noah didn't come from strategy. He came from love. Whatever shape that love was in, whatever complexity surrounded it, at the bottom of it was two people who had genuinely felt something for each other. And that feeling, in a completely unplanned way, made a person. And that person is going to grow up knowing who he came from and what it cost and what it meant. And he is going to make something of that knowledge, or he is not. And either way, it will be his choice. That is all any of us can ask for, really. The chance to know where we come from, and then the freedom to decide where we go. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early December. Noah was 18 months old, and the year had turned the corner from fall into something that felt genuinely different from the year it had been. When Danny Park called me, I hadn't spoken to him since that coffee shop conversation, early in all of this, when he told me about Ethan's words, about seeing people for who they were. He sounded older on the phone, which was probably just the passage of time, but it struck me. Mrs. Cole, he said, I hope it's okay that I called. Of course it is, Danny. I've been following things as much as I could from the outside. He paused. I wanted to tell you that what you did, keeping the company going, protecting what Ethan built, he stopped. I could hear him composing himself. He used to say that the best thing he'd ever done was convince you to be the trustee. He said it before he even knew he was sick. He said, if anything goes sideways, my mum will figure it out. I thought you should know that. I stood at my kitchen window. The oak tree was bare now, the way it got in December, just the shape of it against the grey sky. I had been looking at that tree for 11 years, and I had never quite noticed before how beautiful the bare shape was. The exact branching, the specific way it divided and subdivided, each smaller branch exactly where the tree's own logic put it. Thank you, Danny, I said. My voice was steady. I had gotten very good at steady. How are you doing? He asked, genuinely. The way that people who knew Ethan asked about Ethan's people. I'm okay, I said. And then, because Danny had earned honesty, some days I'm better than okay, some days I'm not. But I'm still here. That's enough, he said. Yes, I said, it is. After I hung up, I stayed at the window for a while. Noah was coming on Saturday. I had bought a set of wooden blocks, the simple kind with letters and shapes, because he seemed like a child who would have opinions about stacking things. I had put them in the kitchen on the low shelf where the wooden spoon had lived, so he would find them the way he found everything, by looking for something else and running into it. I thought about Ethan at 38, sitting at the same table, pushing lemon cookies around a plate, telling me about the trust, asking me to promise. I thought about Lucas at 26, throwing that football against the side of the house, laughing at something I'd said, alive and loud and completely unaware that he had less than 5 years left. I thought about Noah, 18 months old, lurching through the world with his arms up and his attention full and everything still ahead of him. 3 coal men, 3 entirely different lives, 3 entirely different kinds of love, the building kind, the laughing kind, and the arriving kind, the kind that shows up without warning and changes the shape of everything just by being here. I had not planned for any of this. I had planned for a quiet retirement and a garden and the occasional Sunday dinner with sons who would grow old at roughly the same rate I did. I had planned for ordinary, for the version of a life that proceeds in the direction you aimed it. Instead, I had gotten this, a year that broke almost everything I thought I knew, a fight I hadn't expected to be equipped for and somehow managed anyway, a grandson through a door I never could have imagined, a company I didn't understand and was learning to steward, and the slow, daily, imperfect work of turning all of it into something that my boys would recognize. I did not get the life I planned. I got the one that needed me, and I have decided, not easily, not without cost, not without the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been doing hard things for a long time and can feel the weight of them in her bones. That is the version I would choose, because here is what I know. Standing at this window in December, with the oak tree bare against the sky, and Saturday 3 days away, you do not get to protect the people you love from the world. You do not get to stand between them and all the things that will happen. You get to love them while they are here, and then you get to carry them when they are not, and you get to make the choices they would have made if they had been given more time. That is the whole of it. That is the inheritance nobody talks about when they talk about inheritance. Not the money, not the company, not the trust documents, the carrying. I have been carrying my boys for a long time now. Ethan for 14 months, Lucas for 4 years, both of them at once, which is a weight that does not get lighter, but does get more familiar. You learn the shape of it. You learn how to hold it so it doesn't throw you off balance. You learn that there are actually days when it feels like less of a burden and more like just a part of yourself. A heaviness that is also a kind of fullness. On Saturday, Noah will arrive in my kitchen. He will assess it with his serious eyes. He will find the blocks on the low shelf. I am certain of this, the way I am certain of very few things anymore. He will carry them to the middle of the floor one by one with the focused determination of someone engaged in genuinely important work. And he will stack them, or try to, because stacking is what you do when you are 18 months old, and you have just discovered that things can be placed on top of other things, and the world will hold them. And I will sit on the floor of my kitchen, because that is apparently who I am now, a woman who sits on the floor, and I will watch him build. I will watch a coal man build something, and I will think, there they are, there they still are, and that will be enough. That will be more than enough. That will be everything.